We all know that no one can influence our opinion. But what about everyone else's? Hello and welcome to our discussion today on an interesting aspect of political communication and democracy, the agenda setting theory. This theory explains how mass media plays an integral role in shaping our perceptions, attitudes, opinions, and behaviors. It shows us what we vote and support, and how we think about it is greatly influenced by policymakers. It is not just about what issues are covered, but also the order by which they are selected and introduced to us. But how does this influence manifest in a democratic society when it comes to voting and the real lives we live in? That's what we are going to explore today. So let's first talk about transitivity. Numbers on a number line obey the principle of transitivity. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then we know that A is also greater than C. While this intuitive property holds true for numbers, it does not hold true for everything. And let's look at voting in democracies. And this is where voter preferences come into play. Imagine that in a democratic society, citizens are voting what policies to make into law. We have 3 voters, because out of 3 we can create a majority. Voter 1 likes policy A, then in the middle he has a policy B, and on the third place he has policy C. Voter 2 has a policy B on the first place, policy C on the second place, and policy A at the last place. And finally we have voter number 3. This voter prefers policy C as first and primary, then policy A, and then policy B. If there was a vote between policy A and B, then policy A would win. If there was a vote between policy B and C, then B would win. So if we look at all the voters, we see that policy A is preferred over policy B, and policy B is preferred over policy C. So one could transitively think that policy A is preferable to policy C. But this is where it becomes tricky. If there was a vote between A and C, then policy C would actually win. So we can conclude that voter preference in general does not follow this rule of transitivity. And this creates an interesting dilemma. Imagine that policy C is currently dominating policy in our society, and we want to hold a vote to switch to policy A. Based on the voter preference, we would not be able to do this. Our society thinks that policy C is better than policy A. But what if you would first vote to switch to policy B, and then we vote to switch to policy A? Our society would first switch from policy C to policy B, and then switch from policy B to policy A. And that is the key problem of our democracy. Manipulation of agenda, the choice and order of policies we vote on, can completely change what policy we end up with. With one agenda, we end up with policy C, and with another agenda, we switch to policy A. With help of some simple math, we can explore implications of this even further. To do this, we need to be able to represent policies numerically. Policies like budget, regulatory policies, foreign policies, criminal law, and others consist of multiple components. In budget, for example, you might spend amount X on program 1 and Y on program 2. In some other policies, you might be leaning towards left or right on the X and Y axis, and so on. Policy then is represented by a single point in that space. Also, let's imagine that each voter has some ideal policy in his head, and that voter would be represented by some other point that is representing his or her ideal policy. This helps us to represent voter preferences. Now let's assume that voters will always prefer a policy that is geometrically closest to them, rather than a policy that is further away. Given the option of two policies which to vote for, voter can measure distance between themselves and each policy and choose the one that is shorter distance, since that is the closest to voters' true ideal policy. With that set in mind, let's see how series of well-chosen votes can choose particularly undesirable outcome. And here is the society with 5 voters, each of them having some ideal policy. Let's represent the current policy of the society in blue color. And this current policy seems to be pretty good fit for everyone and good compromise between all of the parties. Now, imagine that we want this as an alternative policy, colored in red color. It is very far away from the voters, and it seems there is no chance that voters would ever choose red policy over the blue policy. However, we, with the knowledge of agenda setting, can find a way. The goal here is to propose one alternative after another that majority of citizens, 3/2, will vote for. And somehow we want to convince voters to choose policy that is much worse. With 5 voters, the key idea will be like this. Each time we propose a policy, we make it slightly better for 3 of them, a majority, but much worse for the other 2. How would we choose that policy? Remember that voter will vote for a new policy if it is geometrically closer to them. And if we draw a circle around any voter with current policy sitting on the edge, all of the policies that are more preferable than current policy will be inside that circle. So let's pick 3 voters and draw circles around them. The overlap between these 3 circles represent the policies that these 3 voters will find acceptable and preferable. We can now pick a point in that region that is slightly better for these 3 and much worse for the other 2. Now we need to keep repeating this process. Pick other 3 voters and draw their circles. Overlap region is the region where 3 will prefer, and we pick a policy that is slightly better for them and much worse for the other 2. And now we repeat again. Each time we propose the new alternative, majority will find it better than the existing policy. So alternative will always win. But because voters who oppose this policy are always hurt more than the voters who are helped, by repeating the process long enough, we can get the policy further and further away from the voters' true preferences. Repeating this enough times, we will find policies so far away from voters' preferred preferences that voters will choose our policy in the end as their preferable. Simply by playing voters against each other, we, the agenda setters, will cause them to agree to the policy that is much worse for everyone than the policy they began with. We did this for 5 voters in 2-dimensional space, but this principle works for more voters too, and more dimensions as well. Even in rare cases where the current policy is so ideally placed that we want to vote against, even the slightest deviation from the perfect alignment will make passing the policy we want possible. We looked into the intricacies of how policy preferences don't always adhere to the principle of transitivity and how agenda setters can have a profound impact on the ultimate policy decisions in a society. The manipulation of the order of policies we vote on can significantly change the policy we end up with. This insight uncovers the power of the agenda setter, demonstrating how they can rival the combined power of the voters who look after their own interests. While our world may not function precisely as this model suggests, and policies are not merely dots in space, It offers us a valuable perspective on the influence of agenda setting in democracy. Understanding these dynamics can empower us to be more aware and proactive participants in our democratic process. And what is the better way to grow knowledge than by checking out one of these Monarchist videos? Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful discussions.